Imagine a world where your execution is not a private affair, but a sold-out Broadway show. In the heart of Rome, 80,000 voices scream for your demise, not because you've committed a crime, but because your suffering is art. For the women of Rome, captives, Christians, and even fallen aristocrats, the arena wasn't just about death, it was about the total erasure of dignity. From mythological reenactments that turned sexual assault into a public play, to the rare, desperate female gladiators fighting for a life of crumbs, the sand stayed red for centuries. This is the Rome the history books often hide. To understand the brutality of the Roman arena, one must first understand the Roman concept of infamia. To the Romans, public spectacle was a way to reinforce the social hierarchy. At the bottom of that hierarchy were women who had lost their status, either through war, debt, or religious persecution. While the men were expected to die with stoic bravery, the spectacles designed for women were often calculated to be humiliating and dehumanizing. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Roman games was the fatal charade. The Romans loved theater, but they demanded realism. If a play called for a character to be burned alive or mauled by a bull, they didn't use special effects. They used a condemned woman. Historical records from authors like Martial describe scenes where women were forced to play the roles of figures from Greek mythology. In one infamous reenactment of the myth of Pasiphae, a woman was placed inside a wooden contraption to be publicly violated by a bull before being torn apart. To the Roman audience, this wasn't just punishment, it was a living lesson in history and morality. The psychological terror of being dressed in fine silks, perfumed, and then led into a pit of wild beasts for the amusement of the emperor is a horror that transcends time. For many early Christian women, the arena was the final test of faith. The damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, was a favorite of the crowds. Unlike the armed gladiators who had a chance to defend themselves, these women were often stripped naked, a supreme act of cruelty in a society that valued modesty for virtuous women, and left naked, or tied to stakes, or left defenseless. The intent was to strip the victim of their humanity before the animals even reached them. The crowd would cheer as leopards or lions were released, watching intently to see if the victims would scream or pray. This wasn't just a physical death, it was a systematic attempt to break the spirit. While much rarer than their male counterparts, the gladiatrices, female gladiators, existed, though their presence was often viewed as a novelty or a freak show rather than a display of skill. These women often came from the lowest rungs of society, though some were fallen daughters of wealthy families looking for a way to pay off debts. They fought under the same brutal conditions as men, but with an added layer of sexualization. They often fought with minimal armor, not for mobility, but for the visual satisfaction of the male gaze. When Emperor Septimius Severus finally banned female combat in 200 AD, it wasn't out of mercy, it was because the sight of women fighting was seen as indecent and a threat to the traditional Roman family structure. Behind every scream in the arena was a massive financial machine. The trade in exotic women for the games was a multi-million sesterce industry. Slave traders would scour the edges of the empire, from the forests of Germania to the sands of North Africa, looking for women who possessed the right look for specific arena themes. In the modern world, we go to the cinema to see stories of heroes and monsters brought to life through CGI. In ancient Rome, the special effects were human flesh. The Roman elite, particularly the emperors, felt a constant pressure to provide novitas, novelty.
It wasn't enough to simply kill a prisoner. The death had to be creative, educational, and, most importantly, entertaining. This gave birth to the fatal charades. For a woman sentenced to the arena, the first step of her execution was the loss of her identity. She was no longer a mother, a daughter, or a prisoner of war. She was a character. The Romans would dress these women in elaborate costumes, gowns of silk, golden crowns, or the rags of a mythological beggar to match a specific story from their legends. The most horrifying aspect of this practice was the reenactment. For example, the myth of Dirce was a popular choice for the games. According to the myth, Dirce was punished by being tied to the horns of a wild bull and dragged to her death. In the Colosseum, the Roman directors would replicate this exactly. A woman would be brought out, stripped of her dignity, and bound to a terrified, enraged bull. The crowd would watch with academic interest as the myth played out in real time, the sand absorbing the very real blood of a woman who had become a prop in a state-sponsored play. While many myths were inherently violent, some were upgraded for the arena. There are accounts of women being dressed as Orpheus, the legendary musician who could charm animals. In these twisted versions, the woman would be placed in a beautifully constructed forest set piece within the arena, surrounded by trees and flowers. She would be given a lyre and told to play. Initially, the animals released would be docile, deer, rabbits, or birds. The audience would laugh at the peaceful scene, but then the trap doors would open. Lions or bears that had been starved for days would be unleashed into the fake forest. The Orpheus would find that her music had no power over the starving predators. This irony, the contrast between the beauty of the myth and the gore of the reality, was the height of Roman sophistication. The treatment of women in the arena wasn't just limited to those on the sand. The Vestal Virgins, the high priestesses of Rome, occupied a bizarre and contradictory space in the spectacle. They were given the most prestigious seats in the house, right next to the emperor. These women, who were sworn to chastity and represented the purity of Rome, were required to witness every decapitation, every violation, and every scream. Their presence served a chilling purpose. It sanctified the violence. If the holy Vestals could watch and give the thumbs down, the pollis verso, to signal a death blow, then the violence was seen as a necessary service to the gods and the state. It was a psychological branding. The message was that even the most pure women of Rome accepted and demanded the blood of the impure. Another gruesome spectacle reserved for women was the use of the tunica molesta. This was a garment soaked in flammable substances like naphtha or pitch, often decorated to look like a regal golden gown. The woman would be forced to walk into the center of the arena, looking like a queen. At a signal, a torch would be applied to the hem of the dress. The crowd would watch as the Golden Queen turned into a pillar of fire. This was often used to reenact the death of Creusa, who was killed by a poisoned, burning robe. For the USA audience, it's hard to wrap the mind around the idea of a stadium of families, mothers, fathers, and children cheering as a woman was literally turned into a human torch in the name of classical education. To make these charades work, the Colosseum utilized a massive underground complex called the Hypogeum. This was a labyrinth of elevators, trapdoors, and cages. The precision of Roman engineering meant that a woman could be standing on a flat floor one moment, and a fully grown forest or a pack of wolves could rise from the floor the next. This element of surprise was crucial to keeping the audience engaged. For centuries, historians dismissed the idea of female gladiators as mere legend or fringe erotica for the Roman elite.
However, archaeological finds, like the famous bronze statue in Hamburg and the Great Dover Street woman in London, have confirmed a haunting truth. Women did fight, they did bleed, and they did die in the shadow of the Colosseum's walls. Why would a woman choose to enter the most hyper-masculine, lethal profession in the ancient world? For most, it wasn't a choice. Many were Amazonia, a common stage name, prisoners of war from warrior cultures like the Sarmatians or Celts, forced to display their barbaric fighting styles for Roman amusement. However, some were Auctorati, free women who volunteered. Driven by crushing debt or a desire to escape the suffocating restrictions of Roman patriarchy, these women signed a contract that allowed them to be burnt, bound, beaten, and killed by the sword. In exchange, they received food, shelter, and a chance at a perverted kind of fame. In a society where a woman couldn't vote or hold office, the arena was the only place she could command the attention of 50,000 people. Unlike the mythological victims, the female gladiator was trained. She attended a ludus, gladiator school, though she likely trained in private or separate quarters to avoid distracting the men. Her gear was a reflection of Roman fetishes and cruelty. While male gladiators were often heavily armored, the women, referred to as ludia, often fought with the subligaculum, a loincloth, and a monica, an arm guard, leaving their chests exposed. This wasn't for tactical advantage. It was to remind the audience that despite their martial skill, they were still objects of sexual consumption. They fought as esidari, chariot fighters, or provocatores, mimicking the legendary battles of the Amazons against the Greeks. One of the most significant pieces of evidence we have is a stone relief from Halicarnassus, modern-day Turkey. It depicts two women, Amazon and Achillea, fighting with shields and short swords. What is most striking about this relief is the inscription Missio. This means both women fought so bravely and skillfully that they were granted a reprieve. They were allowed to leave the arena alive that day. This tells us that the audience didn't always want to see these women die. Sometimes they respected the sheer masculine grit displayed by the female body. But this mercy was rare. For every Achillea who earned a reprieve, dozens of others were dispatched when the crowd grew bored of the novelty. While the lower classes found the female gladiators fascinating, the Roman intelligentsia found them disgusting. The satirist Juvenal wrote scathingly about women who donned the helmet and practiced the thrusts, suggesting that a woman who entered the arena had abandoned her soul. What modesty can a helmeted woman show who deserts her sex and delights in feats of strength? Juvenal, Satires. This highlights the unique psychological torture these women faced. Even if they won, even if they survived, they were infames, legally equivalent to prostitutes or actors. They could never return to polite society. They were trapped in a loop of violence, fighting to survive another day in a world that cheered for their courage while simultaneously loathing their existence. The Emperor Domitian was particularly fond of female gladiators, but he added a layer of surreal cruelty. He frequently staged matches by torchlight. In the flickering orange glow of thousands of oil lamps, women would be forced to fight not just each other, but dwarfs. The eyed audience found the height difference and the frantic nature of the combat hilarious. It turned the struggle for survival into a grotesque comedy. Imagine the psychological state of a woman, a former princess of a conquered tribe, forced to fight a mocking battle in the dark while the most powerful men in the world laughed at her movements. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, the Roman arena had evolved. It was no longer just a place for sport or mythological plays. It was a tool for political and religious purification. As Christianity spread through the Roman streets like wildfire, the emperors saw it as a contagion that threatened the Pax Romana. To stop it, they targeted the heart of the Christian movement, its women. For a Roman woman, her honor was tied to her modesty and her submission to the state gods. The Roman prosecutors knew that for Christian women, public exposure was often more terrifying than death itself. In the infamous trials before the games, women were often told that if they simply burned a pinch of incense to the image of the emperor, they could go free. When they refused, the punishment was designed to strip away their sanctity. They were often sent to the lupanaria, state brothels, before being sent to the arena, or forced to enter the stadium completely naked. To the Roman audience, this was a way of saying, your God cannot even provide you with a veil. The passion of Perpetua and Felicity is the most well-documented account of women in the arena. Perpetua was a 22-year-old noblewoman, and Felicity was an enslaved woman. In the eyes of Rome, they were at opposite ends of the social ladder, but in the arena, they were both flesh for the beasts. The records tell a harrowing story. Perpetua had a nursing infant, and Felicity was 8 months pregnant when arrested. In a display of chilling legalism, the Romans waited until Felicity gave birth in her prison cell before dragging her into the arena, because Roman law forbade executing a pregnant woman. When they were finally led onto the sand, they were attacked by a mad heifer, a female bull, chosen specifically to mock their femininity. Perpetua, even while being tossed by the animal, reportedly stood up and pinned her hair back because disheveled hair was a sign of mourning, and she refused to mourn her victory for Christ. This defiance infuriated the crowd. One of the most brutal realities of the arena was that the animals didn't always kill quickly. Often the lions or leopards would be shy or uninterested in the victims. This led to a prolonged agony where women were mauled but left alive, bleeding in the heat of the sun while the audience booed. When the animals failed to finish the job, the confector, an executioner dressed as the god Mercury or Charon, would step out. Perpetua's death was particularly haunting. The young gladiator assigned to kill her was so nervous that his hand shook, and he merely stabbed her in the shoulder. Perpetua reportedly took the trembling blade and guided it to her own throat. For those the emperor wanted to make a special example of, the animals were deemed too quick. Instead, they used the iron chair. This was exactly what it sounds like, a chair made of heavy iron placed over a pit of burning coals. Women like Saint Blandina were bound to these chairs. The crowd would watch as the metal turned cherry red and the smell of roasting flesh filled the stadium. Blandina was reportedly kept alive through hours of this torture, being taken out of the chair, scourged, and then put back in, while she repeated only one phrase, "I am a Christian, and no wickedness is done among us." What does it do to a society to watch a nursing mother be torn apart by dogs? For the USA audience, it's a question of psychological decay. The Romans didn't see themselves as evil. They saw this as justice. The arena functioned as a moral theater. By destroying the bodies of these rebel women, the state was reinforcing the idea that the emperor's power was absolute. The screams of the martyrs were intended to be drowned out by the cheers of 50,000 citizens, creating a collective bond of blood that made every spectator an accomplice to the state's cruelty. For nearly 700 years, the sands of the Roman arenas were soaked with the blood of women, men, and beasts. It was an industry of death that seemed immortal. Yet, like all things built on cruelty, the foundation eventually began to crack. The end of the games wasn't a sudden act of mercy. It was a slow, painful realization that a society fueled by slaughter cannot sustain itself forever. The turning point for the arena didn't come from a politician, but from the very people who had been its victims. As Christianity moved from the shadows of the catacombs to the halls of the imperial palace, the moral justification for the games began to erode. The most famous catalyst for change was the story of Saint Telemachus. In 391 AD, this monk rushed into the arena to separate two combatants, crying out for the crowd to stop the madness. The audience, addicted to their entertainment, stoned him to death on the spot. However, the Emperor Honorius was so moved by the senselessness of the act that he issued a ban on gladiator combat. While animal hunts, venationes, continued for some time, the era of organized human slaughter for sport had finally met its match. For the USA audience, the most chilling aspect of Rome's greatest show isn't just the physical pain inflicted on the women, but the normalization of it. Rome was the first mass media society. They didn't just kill, they'd broadcasted the death to the masses. When we look back at the women of the arena, the gladiatresses who fought for a scrap of honor, the martyrs who burned for their faith, and the unnamed victims of fatal charades, we see the birth of a dangerous human tendency, the ability to turn someone else's agony into a content experience. The Romans had merchandise for famous gladiators, and they kept detailed statistics on deaths. They had turned the female body into a disposable commodity for public consumption, a precursor to the darker corners of modern exploitation.
Today, when you walk through the ruins of the Colosseum in Rome or the amphitheaters in Arles and Tunisia, the stones are silent, but the architecture tells the story. You can still see the narrow corridors where women were held in darkness, hearing the roar of the crowd above them. You can see the Libitina Gate, the gate of death, through which the bodies of the fallen were dragged with meat hooks to be stripped of their costumes and dumped into mass pits. For the women of Rome, the arena was a place where their voices were silenced by the cheers of thousands. But history has a way of speaking through the silence. The archaeological discovery of female gladiator graves proves that despite every effort to shame them, these women possessed a strength that the Roman writers couldn't fully erase. The story of ancient Rome's brutal spectacles is often sold as a gladiator movie, filled with muscles and glory. But the reality was a systematic, state-sponsored war on the vulnerable, particularly women. We remember these inhumane spectacles not to dwell on the gore, but to recognize the warning signs of a society that loses its empathy. The Roman Empire didn't fall because of barbarian invasions alone. It fell because it had hollowed out its own soul, replacing civic virtue with a blood-soaked circus. The women of the arena, the ones forced to play goddesses, the ones who gripped swords with trembling hands, and the ones who faced the lions with prayers on their lips, are the true protagonists of this history. They were the casualties of an empire that forgot how to be human. In the modern day, their stories serve as a haunting reminder that the civilization we build is only as strong as the mercy we show to the most defenseless among us.